The wagon wheels creaked to a halt as Martha Brennan clutched her 6-month-old daughter closer to her chest. Through the canvas cover, she could hear the heated argument outside, voices rising, fear thick in the mountain air. "Leave her," someone shouted. "She's got consumption, and that baby won't last the week up here." Her husband, Thomas, lay motionless beside her, his fever having claimed him just 3 days prior. The other settlers had made their decision. But high above on the rocky outcrop, a lone figure watched through the scope of his rifle, his weathered face set in grim determination. What happened next would change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Wyoming Territory stretched endlessly in all directions, its harsh beauty both magnificent and merciless. October 1847 had brought an early winter to the Rockies, and the Brennan wagon train found itself trapped between two impossible choices: push forward through treacherous mountain passes with winter closing in, or turn back and face certain starvation on the plains. Martha had been coughing blood for weeks now. The telltale signs of consumption had appeared shortly after they'd crossed the Continental Divide, and everyone in the wagon train knew what it meant. Disease was a death sentence out here, not just for the afflicted, but potentially for everyone who traveled with them. The 23 families that made up their group had already lost 6 people to various ailments and accidents since leaving Independence, Missouri, 5 months earlier. The argument had been building for days. Samuel Whitmore, the wagon train leader, had initially resisted the calls to abandon Martha and her baby, but as her condition worsened and supplies dwindled, even he began to waver. The other families had children too, he reasoned. They had obligations to the living. "She can't keep up," declared Edgar Cartwright, a burly blacksmith from Ohio whose own wife had given birth to twins just 2 weeks into the journey. "Look at her, she can barely sit upright. And that cough. We'll all be dead before Christmas if we keep her with us." Margaret Foster, an older woman who had served as the group's unofficial physician, shook her head sadly. "I've done what I can, but without proper medicine." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence that everyone already understood. The wagons had been circled for 3 days now in a narrow valley called Bitter Creek, named for the alkaline water that ran through it. The location offered some protection from the wind, but it was far from ideal for an extended stay. Game was scarce, firewood was running low, and every day they delayed increased the risk of being caught by the full force of winter. Thomas Brennan had been a good man, a carpenter from Pennsylvania who had dreams of starting fresh in the Oregon Territory. He'd met Martha at a church social in Philadelphia, and they'd married just 8 months before deciding to join the westward migration. Their daughter, little Sarah, had been born during a brief stop in St. Louis, and Thomas had sworn she would grow up in a land of opportunity, not the crowded, disease-ridden cities of the East. But Thomas was gone now, claimed by mountain fever just as they'd reached the most dangerous part of their journey. Martha had watched helplessly as her husband's strong hands grew weak. His steady breathing became labored gasps, and finally silence. They'd buried him beside the creek, marked only by a crude wooden cross that would likely be swept away by spring floods. Now she sat alone in their wagon, holding Sarah close, listening to the heated debate that would determine their fate. Her own breathing had become increasingly difficult, and she knew the others weren't wrong about her condition. Consumption was indeed spreading through her lungs like wildfire. But Sarah was healthy, strong, with bright blue eyes and her father's determined chin. The baby deserved a chance at life. "We leave at first light," Whitmore finally announced, his voice heavy with the weight of command. "Anyone who can't keep up gets left behind. That's the law of the trail, and we all knew it when we started this journey." The decision, though brutal, was not without precedent. Wagon trains across the frontier had been forced to make similar choices countless times. The survival of the group always took precedence over the individual, no matter how heartbreaking the circumstances might be. As darkness fell over Bitter Creek, Martha prepared for what she knew would be her last night with other human beings. She had no illusions about her chances of survival alone in the wilderness with a baby. The nights were already dropping below freezing, and winter storms could arrive without warning in these mountains. Still, she found herself strangely calm, perhaps because she had already accepted the inevitable. What she didn't know was that her situation had not gone unnoticed. High up on the surrounding cliffs, a pair of sharp eyes had been watching the wagon train for the better part of a week. The watcher moved like a shadow among the rocks, invisible to the settlers below, but acutely aware of everything happening in their camp. Ezra McKinnon had been living in these mountains for the better part of 15 years. He'd come west as a young man in the 1830s, originally intending to try his luck in the California goldfields. But somewhere along the way, he'd discovered that the mountains themselves were more valuable to him than any precious metal hidden beneath them. The solitude, the challenge, the pure struggle for survival. It had become his life. At 42, McKinnon was built like the terrain he called home, lean, hard, and seemingly carved from the rock itself. His hair had gone prematurely grey from years of exposure to mountain sun and snow, and his face bore the kind of deep lines that came from squinting across vast distances and weathering countless storms. He moved through the wilderness with the fluid grace of a predator, every step calculated, every sense alert. Most people assumed that men like McKinnon were running from something, the law, a woman, a past too painful to face. But in his case, it was simpler than that. He had simply found where he belonged, and it happened to be in a place where most humans couldn't survive more than a few days. His cabin was built into a natural cave system, about 8 miles northeast of where the wagon train had made camp. It was invisible from below, accessible only by a treacherous path that he had carefully concealed over the years. Inside, he had everything he needed to survive indefinitely: stores of dried meat, basic tools, warm furs, and most importantly, complete solitude. But McKinnon wasn't heartless. He had helped lost travelers before, usually by leaving supplies where they could find them or by quietly guiding them towards safer routes. He preferred to remain invisible, a guardian angel that the settlers never knew existed. Direct contact with other people had become increasingly difficult for him over the years. Too much civilization made him nervous, uncomfortable in his own skin. Through his spyglass, he had watched the drama unfolding in the settler camp with growing concern. He'd seen Thomas Brennan die, watched Martha's condition deteriorate, and observed the increasingly desperate discussions among the wagon train leaders. When he saw them preparing to abandon the woman and baby, something inside him stirred, an emotion he thought he'd buried long ago. The night before the wagons were scheduled to depart, McKinnon made his way down from his mountain perch for a closer look. Moving silently through the darkness, he positioned himself near the Brennan wagon, listening to Martha's labored breathing and the soft sounds of baby Sarah stirring in her sleep. Martha was awake, staring up through the wagon cover, at the stars that blazed with impossible brightness in the thin mountain air. She had been thinking about Thomas, about the life they had planned together, about the future that Sarah would now never have. The coughing fits were coming more frequently now, each one leaving her weaker than the last. "Thomas," she whispered, into the darkness. "I'm sorry I couldn't keep her safe. I really tried." From his hiding place 20 feet away, McKinnon heard those words and felt something crack inside his chest. Not his ribs, but something deeper, something he'd kept carefully protected for 15 years of solitude. He had no experience with Babies barely remembered how to talk to women and had no business getting involved in other people's problems. But as he watched Martha struggle to suppress another coughing fit while trying not to wake her daughter, he found himself making a decision that would change everything. The wagon train departed Bitter Creek just after sunrise, 22 wagons rolling west toward an uncertain future. They left behind one wagon, one dying woman, one healthy baby, and supplies that would last perhaps a week if carefully rationed. Samuel Whitmore had privately given Martha his own rifle and a pouch of ammunition, though they both knew she was too weak to use either effectively. As the sound of creaking wheels and lowing oxen faded into the distance, Martha sat alone in the vast silence of the mountains, holding Sarah close and trying to figure out how to make their final days as comfortable as possible. She had perhaps 2 weeks left, maybe less. The baby might survive a few days after that, but probably not much longer. What Martha didn't know was that she was not alone. As the last wagon disappeared around a bend in the valley, Ezra McKinnon emerged from his hiding place and began the most important mission of his solitary life. The morning sun cast long shadows across Bitter Creek as Martha struggled to start a fire with the meager supplies left behind. Her hands shook, not just from weakness, but from the bitter cold that seemed to seep through her very bones. Sarah had been fussing most of the night, sensing perhaps that something fundamental had changed in their small world. Martha had managed to heat some water and prepare a thin gruel from their remaining flour, but eating had become increasingly painful. Each swallow felt like swallowing broken glass, and she knew her time was running short. Still, she forced herself to eat small amounts, knowing that Sarah depended on her milk for survival. The baby had fallen asleep again, wrapped in every blanket Martha could spare. Despite everything, Sarah appeared healthy and strong, her tiny chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. Martha found herself memorizing every detail of her daughter's face, the way her eyelashes curled slightly upward, the small dimple in her left cheek, the perfect miniature fingernails that seemed impossibly delicate yet perfectly formed. "At least you won't remember this," Martha whispered, touching Sarah's soft cheek with one finger. "You won't remember being afraid or cold or hungry. Maybe that's mercy." What Martha didn't realize was that every word she spoke, every movement she made, was being carefully observed from the rocky outcropping above. Ezra McKinnon had been watching since before dawn, studying the woman and child with the same intense focus he used when tracking game through dense forest. McKinnon had spent the night wrestling with conflicting impulses. His survival instincts, honed by 15 years of mountain living, told him to stay away. Getting involved with dying strangers was dangerous, complicated, and ultimately pointless. Disease was common on the frontier, and death was simply part of the natural order. He had no business interfering, but something about the scene below kept drawing his attention back. Perhaps it was the way Martha fought to care for her baby, even as her own strength failed. Perhaps it was the memory of his own sister, who had died of fever when they were both children back in Tennessee. Or perhaps it was simply that after 15 years of complete solitude, some deeply buried part of his humanity was finally reasserting itself. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. McKinnon had originally come to these mountains to escape the complications of civilization. He'd been a different man then. Younger, angrier, carrying wounds that seemed too deep to heal. A failed marriage, business partners who had betrayed him, family members who had chosen sides in disputes that now seemed petty and meaningless. The mountains had offered him peace, or at least the absence of human complications. But watching Martha struggled to survive while protecting her baby, McKinnon found himself remembering why he had once cared about other people. There was something pure about her determination, something that reminded him of what was best in human nature rather than what was worst. The decision, when it finally came, felt inevitable. McKinnon had survived in these mountains by trusting his instincts, and right now every instinct he possessed was telling him to act. He gathered his supplies and began making his way down the treacherous path toward the valley floor. Martha was attempting to reorganize the wagon's contents when she heard the sound of approaching footsteps on gravel. Her heart seized with terror. Wild animals were common in this area, and she was in no condition to defend herself or Sarah. She grabbed Thomas's rifle with trembling hands, though she knew she barely had the strength to lift it, let alone aim. And fire! The footsteps stopped just outside the wagon, and Martha held her breath. Then a voice spoke, deep, rough from disuse, but unmistakably human. "Ma'am? I'm not here to harm you. I've been watching your camp, and I think I might be able to help." Martha's relief was so overwhelming that she nearly dropped the rifle. Who are you?" she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "Name's McKinnon. I live up in these mountains. I saw what happened with your people yesterday morning." Slowly, carefully, Martha made her way to the back of the wagon and pulled aside the canvas cover. What she saw was unlike any man she had ever encountered. McKinnon stood about 6 feet tall, dressed in buckskins that looked like they had been crafted by his own hands. His hair was steel grey and hung past his shoulders, and his beard was streaked with silver. But it was his eyes that struck her most, pale blue and incredibly alert, like the eyes of a wolf. "You live out here alone?" Martha asked, studying this unexpected apparition. "For quite a while now," McKinnon replied simply. "Long enough to know that you and your baby won't last another week in this weather." The blunt assessment should have been frightening, but Martha found it strangely comforting to hear someone speak the truth plainly. The other settlers had spent weeks talking around her condition, offering false hope and empty reassurances. McKinnon's honesty felt like a relief. "I know," she said quietly. "I've been trying to figure out how to make Sarah as comfortable as possible when I can't take care of her anymore." McKinnon studied her for a long moment, taking in her obvious illness, but also noting the fierce determination in her eyes. This was not a woman who would give up easily, even in the face of impossible odds. "What if I told you there was another option?" he said finally. Martha felt something stir in her chest. Not hope exactly, but curiosity. "What kind of option?" "I've got a place up in the rocks. It's warm, dry, well supplied. I've got medicines that might help your condition, at least enough to give you more time. And if—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "If the worst happens, I give you my word that I'll make sure your daughter is taken care of." The offer was so unexpected that Martha wasn't sure she had heard correctly. "You'd do that for strangers?" McKinnon was quiet for a long moment, looking out across the valley toward the snow-capped peaks in the distance. "I haven't talked to another human being in over 2 years," he said finally. "I'm not sure I remember how to be around people anymore. But that baby deserves a chance, and you deserve better than dying alone in a wagon." Martha felt tears well up in her eyes, the first tears she had allowed herself to shed since Thomas's death. "Why would you help us? You don't even know our names." "Sometimes that doesn't matter," McKinnon replied. "What matters is doing what's right when you have the chance." The practical part of Martha's mind immediately began raising objections. How did she know this strange mountain man could be trusted? What if his help came with expectations she couldn't meet? What if accepting his offer only prolonged their suffering without actually changing the outcome? But as she looked down at Sarah, still sleeping peacefully despite the chaos surrounding her young life, Martha realized that she had to take the chance. Even if McKinnon's offer only bought them a few more weeks, a few more days, it was better than sitting in this wagon waiting for death to arrive. "My name is Martha Brennan," she said, extending her hand formally. "This is my daughter, Sarah." McKinnon took her hand gently, careful not to grip too hard given her obvious fragility. "Pleased to meet you both. Now let's get you out of this. A cold before that weather front moves in." As if summoned by his words, the wind suddenly picked up, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of a serious storm. McKinnon's weather sense, developed over years of mountain living, told him they had perhaps 6 hours before conditions became truly dangerous. Working quickly but carefully, he helped Martha gather the most essential supplies from the wagon. Food, blankets, Sarah's few possessions, Thomas's rifle and ammunition, and a small wooden box that contained Martha's most precious personal items: her wedding ring, a daguerreotype of her parents, and a lock of Thomas's hair. The journey to McKinnon's cabin would normally have taken about 3 hours on foot, but with Martha's condition and the baby to consider, he knew it would take much longer. He had fashioned a crude but serviceable travois from wagon parts and buffalo hide, which would allow Martha to rest during the most difficult portions of the climb. As they prepared to leave Bitter Creek behind, Martha took one last look at the wagon that had been her home for the past 5 months. It seemed impossible that her entire life had been reduced to what they could carry on their backs, but she found herself surprisingly untroubled by the thought. Possessions, she had learned, mattered much less than she had once believed. "Ready?" McKinnon asked, shouldering his pack and adjusting the straps of the travois. Martha nodded, clutching Sarah close to her chest. Whatever lay ahead, it had to be better than waiting alone for the inevitable. And for the first time since Thomas's death, she felt something that might have been hope beginning to stir in her heart. The climb began gently enough, following game trails that wound between massive granite boulders and stands of hardy pine. Trees. McKinnon moved with the sure-footed confidence of someone who had traveled these paths countless times, pausing frequently to check on Martha and adjust their route based on her energy levels. After about an hour of steady climbing, they reached a small plateau where McKinnon called for a rest. Martha was grateful for the break, though she tried to hide how labored her breathing had become. The thin mountain air made every step more difficult than it should have been, and she could feel her strength ebbing with each passing hour. "How much further?" she asked, trying to keep the worry out of her voice. McKinnon studied the terrain ahead, mentally calculating distances and elevation changes. "About 2 more hours, maybe 3. But don't worry about the time. We'll go as slow as you need." Sarah had been remarkably well behaved during the journey so far, seeming to sense that this was not a time for fussing. She looked around with bright, curious eyes, taking in the vast landscape of rock and sky with the fearless wonder that only very young children possessed. As they prepared to resume climbing, the first snowflakes began to fall. Just a few scattered. Flakes at first, but McKinnon knew it was the leading edge of something much more serious. He'd seen storms develop in these mountains before, and he recognized the signs. They needed to reach shelter soon. "The weather's changing," he told Martha, helping her to her feet. "We might need to pick up the pace a bit." Martha looked up at the darkening sky and nodded grimly. She understood that their lives now depended on reaching McKinnon's cabin before the full force of the storm arrived. Drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed, she adjusted Sarah in her arms and prepared for the final push toward safety. The last 2 hours of the journey tested every ounce of determination that both Martha and McKinnon possessed. The snow began falling more heavily, making the rocky path treacherous and reducing visibility to just a few yards. McKinnon had to rely on his intimate knowledge of the terrain to navigate, while Martha focused simply on putting one foot in front of the other and not dropping her precious cargo. When they finally reached the concealed entrance to McKinnon's cave system, Martha was barely conscious on her feet. The travois had proven invaluable during the steepest sections of the climb, but even with that assistance, the journey had pushed her far beyond her physical limits. McKinnon quickly cleared away the brush and rocks that hid his front door, revealing an opening that seemed to lead directly into the heart of the mountain itself. Warm air flowed out from the cave, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and something that smelled remarkably like home-cooked food. "Welcome to my place," McKinnon said simply, helping Martha through the entrance just as the storm outside began in earnest. Behind them, the wind howled and snow fell in sheets, but inside the cave, they were warm, dry, and safe. For the first time in weeks, Martha allowed herself to believe that they might actually survive. The cave entrance opened into a narrow passage that curved sharply to the right, completely concealing what lay beyond from any outside observer. As McKinnon led Martha deeper into the mountain, the passage gradually widened and the ceiling rose higher above their heads. Oil lamps mounted on natural stone shelves cast a warm golden light that danced across walls carved by centuries of underground water flow. After about 50 feet, the passage opened into a spacious chamber that took Martha's breath away. The main living area was easily 30 feet across and 20 feet high, with natural alcoves carved into the rock walls, serving as storage spaces and sleeping areas. A fire burned cheerfully in a stone hearth that McKinnon had crafted himself, with a sophisticated chimney system that vented smoke through hidden cracks in the cave ceiling. The space was surprisingly comfortable and well organized. Hand-hewn wooden furniture, a table, chairs, shelves, filled the room with a warmth that seemed impossible in this remote mountain location. Thick, bearskin rugs covered the stone floor, and oil paintings of mountain landscapes hung on the walls, though Martha couldn't imagine how they had made their way to this isolated retreat. "How long did it take you to build all this?" Martha asked, settling carefully into a chair near the fire while keeping Sarah close to her chest. "About 5 years to get the basic living space habitable," McKinnon replied, hanging up his coat and moving to tend the fire. "I've been adding improvements ever since. When you've got nothing but time and the need to stay busy, you'd be amazed at what you can accomplish." Sarah began to fuss, and Martha realized the baby was hungry. She hesitated, unsure of the etiquette involved in nursing an infant in front of a man she'd just met, but McKinnon seemed to understand her discomfort. "I'll be in the back chamber checking on our food stores," he said tactfully. "Take all the time you need to get settled." As McKinnon disappeared into another part of the cave system, Martha allowed herself to really examine her surroundings. Every detail spoke of painstaking craftsmanship and careful planning. The hearth was designed to provide maximum heat with minimum smoke. The furniture was built to last centuries, not just seasons. Storage areas were organized with military precision, containing everything from preserved food to medical supplies to books. More books than Martha had expected to find anywhere west of the Mississippi. The realization gradually dawned on her that this wasn't just a survivalist's hideout. It was a home in the truest sense of the word. McKinnon hadn't simply carved out a shelter from the wilderness. He had created a space where a person could not just survive, but actually live with dignity and comfort. When McKinnon returned, he carried a steaming bowl that smelled like heaven to Martha's starved senses. "Venison stew," he explained, setting it down on a small table beside her chair. "I shot the deer 3 days ago, and I've been keeping the pot going ever since. There's wild onions and some herbs I grow in the back chambers." Martha accepted the bowl gratefully, surprised to discover that she actually felt hungry for the first time in weeks. The stew was rich and flavorful, seasoned with herbs she couldn't identify, but that somehow tasted like the essence of the mountains themselves. "You grow herbs?" she asked between careful spoonfuls. "I've got a whole garden system set up in some of the deeper chambers. Natural light comes in through cracks in the ceiling, and I've diverted part of an underground stream to provide irrigation. Potatoes, onions, some medicinal plants, even a few fruit trees in larger caverns. It took years to get the soil composition right, but now I'm almost completely self-sufficient." The scope of McKinnon's underground domain was becoming clearer to Martha, and she found herself amazed by the ingenuity and determination it must have taken to create such a place. "How many rooms are there?" "Depends on how you count them. The cave system goes back about half a mile into the mountain. I've explored most of it and made use of probably a dozen chambers for various purposes. Living space, food storage, workshop, root cellar, even a library of sorts." "A library?" McKinnon looked slightly embarrassed. "I used to be a educated man before I came out here. Old habits die hard, I suppose. Whenever I made trips to trading posts or towns, I'd pick up books when I could afford them. Over the years, it adds up." Martha was intrigued by this glimpse into McKinnon's past, but she could see that he wasn't entirely comfortable discussing his previous life. Instead, she focused on the present reality of their situation. "About my condition," she said carefully. "You mentioned that you had medicines that might help. I don't want to get my hopes up, but—" McKinnon nodded seriously. "I'm not going to lie to you, Martha. Consumption is serious and it's advanced pretty far in your case. But I've got willow bark extract for the fever and pain, pine needle tea. That's good for respiratory problems, and some other remedies I've learned over the years. They won't cure you, but they might give you more time and make you more comfortable." The honesty was both disappointing and reassuring. Martha had grown tired of false hope, but the possibility of even a few more comfortable weeks with Sarah was precious beyond measure. "There's something else," McKinnon continued. "The high altitude and dry air up here can actually be beneficial. For lung conditions, I've seen it before with other respiratory ailments. Your breathing might improve somewhat just from being here." Over the following days, a routine began to establish itself in the cave. McKinnon proved to be a surprisingly attentive caretaker, preparing meals, maintaining the fire, and even helping with Sarah when Martha's strength failed her. The baby seemed to thrive in the stable environment, sleeping more soundly and fussing less than she had during the difficult wagon journey. Martha's condition did indeed seem to stabilize somewhat in the clean mountain air. Her coughing fits became less frequent, and she found herself able to eat more substantial meals. The improvement was modest, but after weeks of steady decline, any positive change felt like a miracle. McKinnon's herbal treatments provided significant relief from her symptoms. The willow bark tea reduced her fever and eased the constant ache in her chest, while a mixture of pine needles and wild mint helped clear her congestion. Most importantly, a tincture made from a plant he called mountain sage seemed to suppress her coughing fits enough that she could sleep for longer periods. "Where did you learn about these medicines?" Martha asked one evening, as McKinnon prepared her nightly dose of remedies. "Trial and error, mostly, and from a Crow medicine man I met in my early years up here. He taught me to read the signs that plants give you about their properties, which ones help with pain, which ones fight infection, which ones can be dangerous if you're not careful." Martha was continually amazed by the depth and breadth of McKinnon's knowledge. He seemed to know something useful about every aspect of mountain survival, from predicting weather patterns to preserving food to crafting tools from raw materials. Yet there was still an air of mystery about him, a sense that he was carrying secrets from his previous life that he wasn't ready to share. One afternoon, while Martha was resting and Sarah was napping, McKinnon disappeared into one of the back chambers and returned with an armload of baby clothes, tiny dresses, blankets, and even a carved wooden cradle. "Where did these come from?" Martha asked, examining the beautifully crafted items. McKinnon's expression darkened slightly. "I made them a long time ago, for a baby that never came," Martha understood immediately and didn't press for details, but the revelation helped explain McKinnon's gentle competence with Sarah. He had prepared for fatherhood once, even if it hadn't worked out as planned. The cradle was a masterpiece of woodworking, carved from what appeared to be cherry wood and fitted with rockers that moved so smoothly they seemed to operate by magic. Sarah took to it immediately, sleeping more peacefully than she had since her father's death. As the days passed, Martha began to notice subtle changes in McKinnon's behavior. The gruff mountain man who had rescued them was gradually revealing glimpses of the educated, civilized person he had once been. His speech became less clipped and more eloquent. He began sharing stories about books he had read, places he had traveled, and ideas he had contemplated during his years of solitude. One evening, as they sat by the fire after Sarah had fallen asleep, McKinnon surprised Martha by producing a violin from one of his storage alcoves. "You play?" she asked. "I used to. Haven't touched it in probably 3 years, so I'm likely to be rusty." He tuned the instrument carefully, his calloused fingers moving with surprising delicacy across the strings. When he began to play, Martha felt tears well up in her eyes. The melody was something classical, something she half remembered from her childhood, but in McKinnon's interpretation, it carried all the loneliness and beauty of the mountains themselves. The music seemed to fill the cave with warmth and humanity, transforming their stone shelter into something that felt like home. "That was beautiful," Martha said when he finished. McKinnon set the violin aside carefully. "Music was important to me once. I thought I'd lost the ability to appreciate it, but having other people here..." He trailed off, seeming surprised by his own words. "What made you come to the mountains, Ezra?" Martha asked gently, using his first name for the first time. He was quiet for so long that she thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I lost everything that mattered to me. My wife died in childbirth along with our son. My business partners cheated me out of everything I'd worked for. My own brother testified against me in court, claiming I'd stolen money that was rightfully mine." He stared into the fire, his eyes distant. "I came out here to get away from people, because people had shown me nothing but cruelty and betrayal." Martha felt her heart break for this man who had saved her and Sarah despite his own deep wounds. "I'm sorry. That must have been incredibly painful." It was. "For a long time, I convinced myself that I was better off alone, that human beings were fundamentally selfish and cruel. But watching you these past few days, seeing how you care for Sarah even when you're barely strong enough to care for yourself, it reminds me that there's goodness in people too." The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. Martha began to see McKinnon not as the mysterious mountain man who had rescued them, but as a fellow human being carrying his own burden of loss and disappointment. And McKinnon, for his part, began to remember what it felt like to care about other people again. But even as they grew closer, both of them remained aware that their time together was limited. Martha's improvement, while encouraging, was temporary at best. The consumption was still there, still slowly destroying her lungs, and they both knew that winter in the mountains would bring new challenges that might prove insurmountable. Still, for now, they had warmth, safety, and each other's company. In a world where survival was never guaranteed, that was more than either of them had dared to hope for. November brought the first serious snowfall to the high country, and with it, a test of both McKinnon's preparations and Martha's resolve. The storm arrived without warning one morning, transforming the mountain landscape from autumn brown to pristine white in a matter of hours. Inside the cave, they could hear the wind howling through the peaks above, but the thick stone walls kept them completely insulated from the fury outside. Martha had been living in McKinnon's sanctuary for nearly 3 weeks now, and the routine they had established felt surprisingly natural. She woke each morning to find that he had already stoked the fire and prepared a breakfast of cornmeal porridge mixed with dried berries and wild honey. Sarah had grown noticeably during their time in the cave, becoming more alert and responsive to the world around her. The baby had also grown attached to Mackinnon in a way that both surprised and pleased Martha. Sarah would track him with her eyes as he moved around the cave, and she seemed to settle more quickly when he spoke to her in his deep, gentle voice. For a man who claimed to have forgotten how to be around people, he showed a remarkable instinct for infant care. "She knows you're protecting us," Martha observed one morning, as Mackinnon carefully lifted Sarah from her cradle to give Martha a chance to rest. "Babies are smart that way," he replied, supporting Sarah's head with practiced ease. "They can sense who's safe and who isn't long before they can understand words." The storm continued for 3 days, dropping nearly 4 feet of snow and creating drifts that reached twice that height in some areas. Mackinnon used the enforced confinement to show Martha more of his underground domain, including chambers she hadn't yet seen. The workshop was perhaps the most impressive space, filled with hand tools that Mackinnon had either crafted himself or acquired through careful trading over the years. Woodworking benches, metalworking equipment, and even a small forge connected to the cave's ventilation system allowed him to create virtually anything he might need for survival. "This is where I made most of the furniture," he explained, running his hand along a workbench that looked like it had been crafted from a single, enormous piece of oak. "And Sarah's cradle, of course. Working with my hands helps pass the time during the long winters." In another chamber, Martha discovered Mackinnon's library, which proved to be even more extensive than she had imagined. Hundreds of books lined shelves carved directly into the stone walls, covering subjects from literature to medicine to engineering. Many were rare or expensive volumes that must have cost Mackinnon significant portions of his limited income over the years. "You have Chaucer," Martha said in amazement, pulling a leather-bound volume from one of the shelves. "And Shakespeare, and is this Voltaire in the original French?" Mackinnon looked embarrassed. "I had a classical education before I came west. Harvard, actually. It seemed a shame to let all that learning go to waste just because I chose to live in the wilderness." This revelation completely changed Martha's understanding of the man who had saved them. Mackinnon wasn't simply a skilled survivalist who had happened to acquire some education along the way. He was a highly educated man who had deliberately chosen to abandon civilization for reasons that ran much deeper than she had realized. "What did you study at Harvard?" she asked. "Theology initially, then philosophy and literature. I was supposed to become a minister, like my father and grandfather." Before me, his voice carried a bitter edge. "I thought I understood something about human nature, about good and evil, about God's plan for the world. Then life taught me how naive I really was." Martha could hear the pain in his voice and chose not to press for more details. Instead, she focused on the books themselves, many of which had been favorites of hers in the days when she had time and energy for reading. "Would you mind if I borrowed some of these? It's been so long since I've had access to good books." "Of course, take whatever interests you. It'll be nice to have someone to discuss them with." Over the following days, as the storm raged outside, Martha rediscovered the joy of losing herself in literature. She found herself particularly drawn to poetry, perhaps because the compressed emotions and carefully chosen words seemed to match her own situation. A life condensed into its most essential elements. Mackinnon proved to be an excellent discussion partner, with insights into literature that came from years of solitary contemplation. Their evening conversations by the fire began to take on the character of university seminars, ranging across topics from philosophy to theology to the nature of human suffering. "Do you still believe in God?" Martha asked one evening after they had been discussing Paradise Lost. Mackinnon was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. "I believe in something, Whether you call it God or fate or the natural order of things, there's clearly some force that shapes our lives in ways we can't predict or control. But I no longer believe that force is necessarily benevolent. What about when good things happen? Like you finding us when we needed help most desperately? Maybe that's just a random chance, or maybe it's the universe balancing out all the terrible things that happened before. He looked at her seriously. What about you? Do you still have faith after everything you've been through? Martha considered the question carefully. I think so, but it's different now. Before Thomas died, I believed that if I was good and faithful, God would protect me and my family. Now I think faith is more about finding meaning in suffering than avoiding it altogether. These philosophical discussions became an important part of their daily routine, providing both intellectual stimulation and emotional connection. Martha found that engaging her mind helped distract from her physical discomfort, while McKinnon seemed to come alive when discussing ideas and literature. But even as they built this intellectual and emotional bond, both remained acutely aware of the practical realities of their situation. Martha's health had stabilized, but not improved dramatically. She had good days and bad days, but the overall trajectory was still downward. And with winter settling in for the long haul, they faced months of confinement that would test both her physical endurance and McKinnon's psychological readiness to share his space. The first real crisis came during the 4th week of Martha's stay. She woke one morning with a fever that had spiked higher than any since her arrival at the cave. Her breathing was labored, and she couldn't keep down even the lightest foods that McKinnon prepared. Sarah seemed to sense her mother's distress and became fussier than usual, crying for long periods despite McKinnon's best efforts to comfort her. The baby was still nursing, and Martha worried that her illness might be affecting the quality or quantity of her milk. I need you to promise me something, Martha said to McKinnon during one of her more lucid moments. Anything. If I die, you'll take care of Sarah. Not just keep her alive, but really take care of her. Teach her to read, tell her about her parents. Help her become the kind of person Thomas and I hoped she would be. McKinnon felt something clench in his chest. The request was exactly what he had expected, but hearing it spoken aloud made the possibility of Martha's death suddenly real in a way it hadn't been before. You're not going to die, he said firmly. Not on my watch. Ezra, please, I need to. Know that she'll be more than just another mountain orphan. She has good blood in her. Thomas was a skilled craftsman and a kind man, and my family has teachers and ministers going back generations. Sarah could be something special if she's given the chance. The fever broke 2 days later, leaving Martha weak but lucid. McKinnon had barely left her side during the crisis, applying cool cloths to her forehead, forcing small amounts of liquid down her throat, and monitoring her breathing throughout the long nights. His dedication had probably saved her life, though. Both of them knew it was likely only a temporary reprieve. The experience changed something fundamental in their relationship. Martha no longer harbored any doubts about McKinnon's commitment to protecting Sarah, and McKinnon found himself caring about Martha's welfare in ways that went far beyond simple humanitarian duty. You could have let me die, Martha said when she was strong enough to have a real conversation again. It would have been easier for you in the long run. No, McKinnon replied simply. It wouldn't have been easier. Nothing about any of this is easy, but that doesn't mean it's not worth doing. As Martha's strength slowly returned, she began taking a more active role in the daily operations of their underground household. She proved to be an excellent cook with the limited ingredients available, and she helped McKinnon organize his storage systems more efficiently. Most importantly, she began teaching Sarah simple songs and games, determined to give her daughter every possible advantage in cognitive development. McKinnon watched these interactions with growing amazement. Despite her illness, despite the uncertainty of their future, Martha remained completely focused on being the best mother she could be. Her dedication reminded him of qualities he had thought no longer existed in human nature: selflessness, hope, and love that persisted even in the face of inevitable loss. One evening in late November, as the first major blizzard of the season howled outside their refuge, Martha made a request that surprised McKinnon. "Would you teach me to shoot?" she asked. "Why?" "Because if something happens to you, I need to be able to protect Sarah. And if I'm going to get worse before I get better, I want to know that I've prepared her as well as I can for life in this place." The request demonstrated a level of pragmatic thinking that McKinnon found both admirable and heartbreaking. Martha was planning for contingencies that included her own death and his potential absence, trying to prepare for every possible scenario that might threaten Sarah's survival. They began shooting lessons the next day, using a small caliber rifle, in one of the deeper chambers where the sound wouldn't echo outside the cave. Martha proved to be a quick learner, with steady hands and good instincts for marksmanship. Within a week, she could hit targets accurately at close range, though her limited strength meant she couldn't handle larger weapons effectively. "You're a natural," McKinnon told her after a particularly good session. "Thomas taught me the basics, back in Pennsylvania, but we never had much opportunity to practice. He said a woman should know how to defend herself and her family." The shooting lessons became another bonding activity, but they also served as a stark reminder of the harsh realities of frontier life. In this remote mountain refuge, there was no law enforcement, no neighbors to call for help, no safety net beyond what they could provide for themselves. As December approached, and the snow continued to accumulate outside, Martha and McKinnon settled into what felt like a strange but comfortable domesticity. They had created a small world within the mountain, complete with its own routines, rituals, and shared purposes. And at the center of it all was Sarah, growing stronger and more aware each day, blissfully unaware of the complex adult emotions and calculations that surrounded her young life. But even in their most peaceful moments, both adults remained conscious that they were living on borrowed time, making the most of whatever days they had been given while preparing for an uncertain future that would test every bond they had formed. December arrived with a vengeance, bringing temperatures that dropped so low the water in their storage containers began forming ice despite being inside the cave. McKinnon had experienced harsh winters before, but this one seemed particularly brutal, even by mountain standards. The wind outside sounded like the howling of demons, and snow accumulated so quickly that the hidden entrance to their cave was completely buried within days. Martha had been watching McKinnon's face during their morning routines, and she could see the concern he was trying to hide. His usual confidence seemed strained, and he spent more time than usual checking and rechecking their food supplies, fuel reserves, and the integrity of their shelter systems. "How bad is it?" she asked one morning as he returned from one of his inspection tours of the cave system. McKinnon hesitated, clearly debating how much truth to share. "It's going to be a long winter. Longer and colder than I've seen in 15 years up here. We need to be extra careful about conserving everything: food, fuel, lamp oil, even our physical energy." What he didn't tell her was that he had discovered a crack in the main chimney system that was allowing some heat to escape. The crack was growing larger with each temperature fluctuation, and if it continued to expand, they could lose a significant portion of their heating efficiency. In temperatures this extreme, that could mean the difference between survival and freezing to death. Sarah had begun sleeping poorly, fussing during the night hours when the cold was most intense. Even with multiple layers of blankets and furs, the baby seemed to sense the harshness of the environment outside their stone walls. Martha spent increasing amounts of time holding her daughter close, sharing body heat and trying to keep her comfortable. The intimacy forced by their circumstances had created an unusual family dynamic. McKinnon found himself taking on responsibilities he had never imagined, helping with Sarah's care, preparing meals that would provide maximum nutrition with minimal resources, and even taking night watches so Martha could get uninterrupted sleep when her coughing fits were particularly bad. "You're good with her," Martha observed one evening, as McKinnon carefully changed Sarah's cloth diaper with the practiced efficiency of an experienced parent. "She's an easy baby to care for. Smart, too. Watch her eyes when I talk to her. She's already trying to understand language." It was true. At 4 months old, Sarah displayed an alertness and responsiveness that seemed advanced for her age. She tracked conversations between the adults, smiled when spoken to directly, and had even begun making deliberate babbling sounds that seemed to mimic the rhythm of human speech. "Thomas would have been so proud of her," Martha said softly. "He always said intelligence was the most important thing we could give our children." McKinnon looked up from his careful work with the baby. "Tell me about him. What was he like when you first met?" Martha's face brightened at the memory. "Confident, but not arrogant. He was the kind of man who could fix anything with his hands, but he never made other people feel stupid for not having the same skills. He courted me for 8 months before he even tried to kiss me. A gentleman, yes, but also practical. He said he wanted to be absolutely certain we were compatible before we made any commitments that couldn't be undone. He'd seen too many marriages fail because people rushed into them based on physical attraction alone." McKinnon found himself oddly jealous of a dead man, which was a feeling he didn't care to examine too closely. "He sounds like he was a good husband." He was. He would have been a wonderful father, too. Martha's voice caught slightly. "I wish Sarah could have known him." The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made both adults freeze in alarm, a deep, rumbling crack that seemed to come from the very bones of the mountain itself. McKinnon immediately moved to the cave entrance, listening intently for any signs that their shelter might be compromised. "What was that?" Martha asked, clutching Sarah protectively. "Probably just the mountain settling under the weight of all this snow. It happens sometimes during extreme weather." But McKinnon's expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by his own explanation. Over the next few days, they heard similar sounds with increasing frequency. Sometimes it was a sharp crack, like breaking timber. Other times, a low groaning that seemed to emanate from deep within the earth. McKinnon began conducting more thorough inspections of their cave system, checking for new cracks, water seepage, or any other signs of structural instability. What he found during one of these inspections made his blood run cold. The crack in the chimney system had indeed grown larger, but more importantly, he discovered evidence of recent rockfall in one of the deeper chambers. The mountain was experiencing some kind of geological stress, possibly triggered by the extreme temperature fluctuations or the massive weight of accumulated snow. That evening, as Martha nursed Sarah by the fire, McKinnon made a decision that would change everything. "We need to talk about something," he said, his voice unusually serious. Martha looked up from the baby, immediately sensing the gravity in his tone. "What's wrong?" "This cave system isn't as stable as I thought. The extreme weather is causing structural problems that could get worse before they get better. We might need to consider alternatives." "What kind of alternatives?" McKinnon took a deep breath. "There's another shelter about 12 miles northeast of here. It's not as comfortable as this place, but it's built in solid granite instead of limestone. If conditions here become dangerous, we might need to make a run for it." The idea of leaving their warm, comfortable sanctuary for the brutal cold outside was terrifying. But Martha could see in McKinnon's eyes that he wouldn't suggest it unless the risk was real. "How would we make a journey like that in this weather?" "With Sarah, Very carefully, and only if we absolutely have to, but I want you to be prepared for the possibility. That night, Martha lay awake listening to the sounds of the mountain around them. Every crack, every groan, every whisper of wind through hidden crevices seemed to carry a message of impending danger. She found herself holding Sarah even closer, as if her mother's embrace could somehow protect the baby from forces beyond human control. The crisis came 3 days later, during what started as an ordinary morning. Martha was preparing breakfast while McKinnon checked their water supply in one of the back chambers. Suddenly, they heard a sound like thunder that seemed to go on forever, followed by a shower of dust and small rocks falling from the ceiling. McKinnon appeared in the main chamber within seconds, his face grim. "Get Sarah and pack only the absolute essentials. We need to leave now." What happened? Major rockfall in the eastern passages. The whole mountain is shifting, and I'm not sure how long this chamber will remain safe. Martha's hands shook as she gathered Sarah's things, but her mind remained clear and focused. She had been mentally preparing for this possibility ever since. McKinnon first mentioned it, and now survival instincts took over. Blankets, Sarah's warmest clothes, the wooden box containing her most precious possessions, and her small supply of personal medicine went into a pack that McKinnon had prepared, specifically for emergency evacuation. McKinnon moved with practiced efficiency, grabbing essential supplies and survival gear. Food that could be eaten without cooking, water containers, ammunition, fire-starting materials, and his heaviest winter clothing. Everything else, the comfortable furniture, the extensive library, the workshop full of handcrafted tools, would have to be left behind. "Are you sure we can't wait for the weather to improve?" Martha asked, as she wrapped Sarah in layers of warm furs. "Look at the ceiling," McKinnon replied grimly. Martha looked up and felt her heart sink. A visible crack had appeared in the stone above their heads, and it was slowly but steadily growing longer. Even as they watched, small pieces of rock continued to fall, and the crack extended another few inches toward the fire pit. "How long do we have?" "Maybe hours, maybe minutes. I don't know, and I don't want to find out the hard way." The journey from the cave to the outside world was like emerging into hell itself. The wind hit them with the force of a physical blow, and the cold was so intense that Martha's lungs seemed to freeze with each breath. Snow was falling so heavily that visibility was reduced to less than 10 feet in any direction. McKinnon had fashioned a crude sled from materials he kept for emergency evacuations, and he loaded it with their essential supplies while Martha focused on keeping Sarah warm and sheltered. The baby was wrapped in so many layers that only her eyes were visible, but she seemed to sense the danger around them and remained unusually quiet and still. "Stay close to me," McKinnon shouted over the wind. "If we get separated in this storm, we're all dead." The 12-mile journey to the backup shelter became a nightmare of endurance and determination. McKinnon broke trail through snow that sometimes reached his waist, while Martha followed in his footsteps, concentrating on nothing but putting one foot in front of the other. The sled containing their supplies left a visible track behind them, but the falling snow filled it in within minutes. After what felt like hours, but was probably less than 2, Martha began to stumble. The combination of physical exertion, thin air, and her underlying illness was pushing her beyond her limits. McKinnon noticed immediately and called a halt, finding a cluster of large boulders that provided some shelter from the wind. I can't keep going," Martha gasped, collapsing against one of the rocks. McKinnon could see that she was right. Her lips were blue with cold, her breathing was labored, and she was shivering uncontrollably despite her heavy clothing. Sarah was still warm and alert in her mother's arms, but Martha herself was approaching the dangerous stages of hypothermia. "Listen to me," McKinnon said, kneeling beside her and speaking directly into her ear to be heard over the wind. "The shelter is only about 4 more miles. I can carry you if I have to." "No, You can't carry both me and Sarah and pull the sled. It's too much weight, and you know it." McKinnon looked at Martha's face and saw a familiar expression, the same fierce determination she had shown when caring for Sarah despite her own illness. She was about to suggest something that he already knew he couldn't accept. "Take Sarah," Martha said firmly. "Get her to safety. Come back for me when the storm passes." "Absolutely not. Ezra, be practical. Sarah has her whole life ahead of her. I have weeks at most, and that's if I'm lucky. Don't let my stubbornness kill all three of us." It was the most rational argument imaginable, and McKinnon hated every word of it. But as he looked at the storm raging around them, at Martha's deteriorating condition, and at baby Sarah depending on both of them for survival, he realized that rational arguments might not be enough to get them through this crisis. The choice that would define the rest of their lives was rushing toward them with the inevitability of an avalanche, and there was nowhere left to run. The wind screamed through the rocks around them with supernatural fury, as if the mountain itself was angry at their attempt to escape. McKinnon crouched beside Martha, his mind racing through calculations that all led to the same terrible conclusion. In these conditions, with this distance to cover, carrying both Martha and Sarah while pulling essential supplies was physically impossible. But accepting Martha's sacrifice felt like a betrayal of everything decent he had left in his soul. "There has to be another way," he said, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't true. Martha reached up with one trembling hand and touched his face, her eyes clear despite her physical distress. "You saved us both when everyone else gave up. You gave me weeks I never would have had, and you gave Sarah a chance at life. That's enough, Ezra. That's more than enough." Sarah whimpered softly in her mother's arms, the only sound she had made during the entire hellish journey. The baby's face was pale but alert, her dark eyes moving between the two adults, as if she sensed the gravity of the moment. McKinnon looked down at the child who had become so important to him over the past months. Sarah represented everything pure and hopeful that remained in the world. Innocence that deserved protection, potential that should not be wasted, love that transcended biological relationships. But accepting responsibility for her meant abandoning Martha to die alone in the storm. "I won't leave you," he said finally. "Then you'll kill us all out of misplaced nobility." Martha's voice carried an edge of steel that cut through the wind. "I'm asking you to save my daughter. Don't make me beg." The moment stretched between them like a taut rope ready to snap. McKinnon had faced life-and-death decisions before, but never one that required him to choose between two people he cared about. His survival instincts, honed by 15 years of mountain living, told him that Martha was right. Attempting to save everyone would likely result in everyone dying. But his heart, which he had thought was permanently frozen by years of betrayal and loss, rebelled against the cold logic of the situation. Then Sarah made the decision for him. The baby began to cry, not the fussy whimpering she had been doing, but a full-throated wail that spoke of genuine distress. Her face was growing pale, and McKinnon realized that even wrapped in furs, she was beginning to suffer from the extreme cold. "She's hypothermic," Martha said, recognizing the signs immediately. "If you don't get her to warmth soon, this whole conversation becomes pointless." McKinnon looked at Sarah's face and saw Thomas Brennan's determined chin, Martha's intelligent eyes, and something entirely her own, a fierce will to live that demanded respect. In that moment, he understood that his choice wasn't between Martha and Sarah, but between honoring Martha's love for her daughter or satisfying his own emotional needs. "Tell me what you want me to say to her when she's old enough to understand," he said quietly. Martha closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, they were filled with both sorrow and relief. "Tell her that her parents loved her more than life itself. Tell her that she comes from good people who believe in doing what's right even when it's hard. And tell her—" Martha's voice broke for just a moment before steadying. Tell her that every day she lives is a victory over the forces that tried to destroy her. McKinnon carefully took Sarah from Martha's arms, wrapping the baby in additional layers from his own clothing. Sarah's crying stopped almost immediately, as if she understood that she was now in the hands of someone who would move heaven and earth to keep her safe. "I'll come back for you as soon as I get her to the shelter," McKinnon said. Martha smiled sadly. "We both know you won't find anything to come back to, but that's all right. This is how it should be." McKinnon wanted to argue, to promise that he would somehow defy the odds and save them both, but the wind was growing stronger, and Sarah's welfare couldn't wait for his emotional processing. He kissed Martha's forehead gently, a gesture that carried all the words they didn't have time to say. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything. Take care of each other," Martha replied. The next 4 miles became a blur of survival instinct and desperate determination. McKinnon abandoned the supply sled, carrying only the most essential items in a pack while holding Sarah against his chest. The baby seemed to understand the gravity of their situation and remained quiet, her small body pressed close to his for warmth. The backup shelter, when they finally reached it, was nothing like the comfortable cave they had left behind. Built into a granite cliff face, it was essentially a reinforced natural alcove with a stone wall across the opening. There was no sophisticated ventilation system, no comfortable furniture, no library or workshop, but it was warm, dry, and structurally sound. McKinnon got a fire started immediately, using the last of his easily accessible tinder to create warmth and light. Sarah's color began to improve almost immediately once they were out of the wind, and she even managed a small smile when he spoke to her softly while checking her condition. "We made it, little one," he said, his voice thick with emotions he couldn't quite identify. "Your mama made sure we made it." But even as he tended to Sarah's immediate needs, McKinnon's mind was already working on the logistics of returning to search for Martha. The storm was still raging outside, but storms always eventually passed. If he could get back to her location, within 12 hours, there was still a chance. The futility of that hope became clear when he examined the shelter's limited supplies. There was enough food and fuel to keep him and Sarah alive for perhaps 2 weeks if they were extremely careful. Leaving Sarah alone while he conducted a rescue mission was impossible. The baby needed constant care and warmth to survive, and taking her with him on another journey through the storm would be suicidal. McKinnon found himself facing a new and terrible reality. He was now solely responsible for a 4-month-old baby in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, with minimal supplies and no realistic hope of outside assistance until spring. Everything he had learned about survival over the past 15 years had been focused on keeping himself alive. Caring for an infant introduced complications he had never imagined. Sarah needed to eat every few hours, but she was still nursing. McKinnon had brought some dried milk powder from their original supplies, but he wasn't sure how to properly prepare it or whether it would provide adequate nutrition. The baby needed to be kept warm constantly, but their fuel supplies were limited. Most importantly, she needed human interaction and stimulation to develop properly, but McKinnon had no experience with child development. As the storm continued to rage outside their small shelter, McKinnon found himself talking to Sarah almost constantly, partly to provide the human contact she needed and partly to keep his own sanity intact. He told her stories about her parents, about the journey west, about the mountains they now called home. "Your father was a good man," he said, as he carefully fed her a mixture of milk powder and warm water. "He would have taught you to work with your hands, to build things that last. Your mother was brilliant. She would have made sure you got a proper education, maybe even sent you back east to college someday." Sarah watched his face intently as he spoke, her dark eyes tracking his movements with the focused attention of someone trying to decode a foreign language. McKinnon found himself wondering what she understood, what she would remember, and how the trauma of these early months would shape her development. The storm finally broke after 18 hours of continuous wind and snow. When McKinnon emerged from the shelter to assess their situation, he found a landscape that had been completely transformed. Snow drifts reached heights of 15 feet in some areas, and the entire geography of the region had been altered by the accumulation. Finding his way back to where he had left Martha would be nearly impossible under these conditions, but McKinnon felt compelled to try. He fashioned a crude cradle board from materials in the shelter and strapped Sarah to his back, then set out to retrace their path from the previous day. What he found was a landscape that bore no resemblance to the route they had traveled. Landmarks had been buried, familiar rock formations were hidden under snow, and in several places, small avalanches had completely altered the terrain. After 4 hours of increasingly desperate searching, McKinnon was forced to accept what he had known from the beginning. Martha was gone. He found himself standing in what he thought might be the approximate location where he had left her, though he couldn't be certain. The wind had scoured some areas clean while piling snow 10 feet deep in others. If Martha's body was here, it was now buried beyond any hope of recovery. "I'm sorry," he said aloud, his words carried away by the wind. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you both." Sarah made a small sound from her position on his back, and McKinnon realized that she was responding to the emotion in his voice. Even at 4 months old, she seemed to sense his grief and was trying to comfort him in the only way she could. The journey back to their new shelter took twice as long as expected, and by the time they arrived, McKinnon was exhausted both physically and emotionally. But Sarah needed care, and there was no one else to provide it. He settled into the routine that would define their lives for the next several months, feeding, changing, warming, and entertaining a growing baby while managing their limited resources and planning for an uncertain future. That night, as Sarah slept peacefully in the small nest he had created for her near the fire, McKinnon sat staring into the flames and trying to process everything that had happened. In the space of 24 hours, he had lost his comfortable home, witnessed the death of someone he had come to care about deeply, and become the sole guardian of a baby who would depend on him for everything, the man who had fled to the mountains. To escape human complexity, now found himself at the center of the most complex human relationship possible, raising a child who wasn't his own, honoring the memory of parents she would never know, and somehow finding the strength to build a future from the wreckage of the past. "It's just you and me now, Sarah," he whispered to the sleeping baby. "Your mama made me promise to take care of you, and that's exactly what I'm going to do, whatever it takes, for as long as it takes." Outside, the wind continued to howl through the mountains, but inside their small shelter, 2 survivors began the slow process of learning to be a family. January brought a cold so severe that water froze solid within minutes of being exposed to air, and the walls of their granite shelter developed a thin coating of ice despite the constant fire. McKinnon had been caring for Sarah alone for nearly a month now, and the learning curve had been steeper than any mountain he had ever climbed. The baby had adapted to her new circumstances with remarkable resilience. She had learned to recognize McKinnon's voice as her primary source of comfort and security, turning her head toward him whenever he entered her field of vision. Her sleep patterns had adjusted to match his, and she seemed to understand instinctively that crying would bring him running, no matter what else he might be doing. But caring for an infant in wilderness conditions presented challenges that no amount of survival experience had prepared McKinnon for. Sarah's nutritional needs were complex and critical. The dried milk powder he had salvaged from their original supplies was running dangerously low, and he had no reliable way to replenish it until spring trading season. More concerning was Sarah's need for constant warmth. The baby's small body lost heat much faster than an adult's, and keeping her comfortable required maintaining the fire at levels that consumed their limited fuel supply at an alarming rate. McKinnon found himself making increasingly difficult decisions about resource allocation, balancing Sarah's immediate needs against their long-term survival prospects. "We're going to have to be creative, little one," he told Sarah one morning, as he calculated their remaining firewood supply. "Your mama always said you were smart. I hope she was right, because we're going to need all the intelligence we can get." Sarah responded with a series of babbling sounds that seemed almost conversational. At 5 months old, she was becoming more interactive every day, reaching for objects that caught her attention and making deliberate eye contact when spoken to directly. McKinnon found himself marveling at the speed of her development, remembering Martha's prediction that Sarah would be exceptional if given the chance. The challenge of keeping Sarah entertained and stimulated became increasingly important as the weeks passed. Babies needed more than just food and warmth. They needed interaction, play, and exposure to language to develop properly. McKinnon had no toys, no children's books, and no experience with infant entertainment, but he improvised with whatever materials were available. He carved simple wooden shapes from scraps of firewood, creating objects of different textures and sizes for Sarah to examine and mouth. He sang songs he half remembered from his own childhood, his rough voice softening as he worked through lullabies and folk tunes. Most importantly, he talked to her constantly, describing everything he was, doing and thinking as if she could understand every word. "Now I'm going to check our water supply," he would say, carrying Sarah with him as he moved around their small living space. "See how the ice forms on the container? That tells us how cold it is outside. When spring comes, all this ice will melt and become streams that run down the mountain." Sarah listened with intense focus, her dark eyes tracking his movements and her small hands reaching out to touch whatever objects came within her range. McKinnon began to suspect that she was indeed understanding more than seemed possible, for her age, filing away information that would serve her well in the years to come. The isolation was harder on McKinnon than he had expected. During his years of solitary living, he had grown accustomed to the rhythm of his own thoughts and the peaceful silence of the mountains. Now his days were filled with the constant demands of childcare, leaving little time for the quiet contemplation that had sustained him for so long. But he also discovered unexpected joys in their daily routine. Sarah's first real smile had come during his 3rd week of caring for her, a genuine expression of happiness that seemed to light up their cramped shelter. Her laughter, when it finally came, was like music in the stone chamber, and her obvious trust in him, demonstrated every time she relaxed in his arms and fell asleep against his chest, gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. "Your mama would be so proud of you," he told Sarah one evening, as he fed her a carefully prepared mixture of milk powder and water, supplemented with tiny amounts of honey. "She always said you had her father's eyes and your daddy's determination. I can see both of those things getting stronger every day." The mention of Martha still brought a sharp pain to McKinnon's chest, but he was determined to keep her memory alive for Sarah's sake. He had begun telling the baby stories about her parents every night before sleep, creating a narrative that would help Sarah understand her origins when she was old enough to comprehend them. "Thomas was the kind of man who could build anything with his hands," McKinnon would say, his voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller. "He made furniture so beautiful that people would travel for miles just to see it. And your mama could read books in 3 different languages. She was going to teach you to love learning, to always ask questions about the world around you." By February, Their food situation had become critical. The preserved meat McKinnon had brought from their original shelter was nearly gone, and hunting in the deep snow was extremely difficult. He had managed to trap a few rabbits and a small deer, but game was scarce, and the energy required to hunt in winter conditions was enormous. More problematically, Sarah's milk powder supply was down to less than a week's worth. McKinnon had tried, diluting it to make it last longer, but he could see that Sarah was losing weight despite his efforts. The baby needed proper nutrition to continue developing, and he was running out of options to provide it. The solution, when it came to him, was both obvious and terrifying. There was a trading post about 30 miles northeast of their current location, operated by a French trapper named Baptiste Mercier, who had been in the region for even longer than McKinnon. If anyone would have supplies suitable for feeding an infant, it would be Mercier. But 30 miles in winter conditions, carrying a baby, was a journey that could easily prove fatal for both of them. The alternative, however, was watching Sarah slowly starve while waiting for spring to arrive. McKinnon spent several days preparing for the expedition, crafting an improved carrier that would keep Sarah warm and secure during the journey while leaving his hands free for navigation and emergency situations. He packed their most essential supplies into a lightweight bundle and cached the remainder in their shelter, hoping they would return to find everything intact. "This is going to be an adventure, Sarah," he told the baby as he made final preparations. "Your first real journey into the wider world. Let's hope Mercier is still where I left him." The journey to the trading post took 3 days of careful travel through terrain that challenged every skill McKinnon had developed over his years in the mountains. Sarah bore the hardships with remarkable stoicism, seeming to understand that silence and patience were essential to their survival. She slept for long periods while they traveled, conserving energy and allowing McKinnon to focus on navigation. Baptiste Mercier's trading post appeared in the distance like a mirage. A cluster of log buildings nestled in a protected valley, smoke rising from multiple chimneys, and the blessed sight of human civilization in the vast wilderness. McKinnon felt a surge of relief so intense it nearly brought him to his knees. Mercier himself was a bear of a man, easily 6.5 feet tall with a beard that reached halfway down his chest. His French accent had been softened by decades in the American wilderness, but his eyes remained sharp and calculating as he assessed his unexpected visitors. "Ezra McKinnon," Mercier said, his voice expressing surprise but not displeasure. "I heard you were dead. Avalanche, they said." "Not dead yet," McKinnon replied, "though it's been a near thing more than once this winter." Mercier's gaze shifted to Sarah, visible in her carrier against McKinnon's chest. "And who is this little one?" "Her name is Sarah. Her parents died and I've been caring for her. She needs milk, Baptiste. Real milk, not powder, and anything else. You might have that suitable for feeding an infant." Mercier studied Sarah's face for a long moment, then looked back at McKinnon with new understanding. "Ah, I see. The mountain hermit has become a father. This is unexpected. Can you help us or not?" "Of course I can help. I have goat's milk, fresh bread, even some preserved fruits that would be good for a growing child." Mercier's expression softened as he watched Sarah's bright eyes take in her new surroundings. "But first, you must tell me how this came to be. It is quite a story, I think." As McKinnon related the events of the past months, he watched Mercier's face shift from skepticism to amazement to something approaching respect. The French trapper had seen many remarkable things during his years in the wilderness, but the tale of a solitary mountain man rescuing and raising an abandoned baby was extraordinary, even by frontier standards. "Martha Brennan," Mercier mused when McKinnon finished his account. "I remember her wagon train. They passed through here in late September, bought supplies for the mountain crossing. The woman was already showing signs of illness, but she had fire in her eyes. Spirit, you know? Yes, McKinnon said quietly, she had spirit. And now you carry that spirit forward in her daughter. It is a sacred trust, mon ami. Not everyone would have the courage to accept such responsibility. That evening, as Sarah slept peacefully in a real crib that Mercier had produced from his trading stock, McKinnon found himself reflecting on how much his life had changed since that October morning when he first watched the wagon train abandon Martha and her baby. The man who had fled to the mountains to escape human complexity was now at the center of the most fundamental human relationship of all. She's going to need more than I can give her, McKinnon admitted to Mercier as they shared a bottle of whiskey by the trading post's main fireplace. Education, social interaction, exposure to the wider world. I don't know how to provide those things. Mercier considered this thoughtfully. Perhaps the question is not what you cannot give her, but what you can. You have already given her life, when others would have given her death. You have given her love when the world showed her only abandonment. These are not small gifts, Ezra. As McKinnon prepared to begin the journey back to their mountain shelter, loaded with supplies that would see them through to spring, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope for the future. Sarah was thriving, growing stronger, and more alert every day, and he was discovering that the love of a child could heal wounds he had thought were permanent. The mountain hermit was becoming something new, something he had never planned to be. He was becoming a father. Spring arrived in the high country with dramatic suddenness, transforming the harsh white landscape into an explosion of green growth and rushing water. The sound of snowmelt cascading down the mountainsides created a constant symphony that seemed to celebrate the end of their long winter ordeal. McKinnon stood at the entrance to their shelter, holding 8-month-old Sarah in his arms as they watched the world come alive around them. Sarah had grown remarkably during their months of isolation. She could now sit up unassisted, had developed a vocabulary of distinct babbling sounds that McKinnon had learned to interpret, and showed an insatiable curiosity about everything within her reach. Her dark hair had grown thick and curly, and her eyes held an intelligence that seemed far beyond her months. "Look at that, Sarah," McKinnon said, pointing to a family of deer grazing in the meadow below their rocky perch. "Those are the first ones we've seen since the snow started melting. They know it's safe to come down from the high places now," Sarah responded, with excited babbling and reaching toward the animals, her small hands opening and closing as if trying to grasp the entire scene. McKinnon had grown to love these moments of shared discovery, watching the world through Sarah's eyes and seeing beauty in things he had long taken for granted. The winter had changed both of them in fundamental ways. McKinnon had discovered reserves of patience and tenderness he never knew he possessed, while Sarah had developed the kind of resilience that came from growing up in challenging circumstances. She rarely cried anymore, seemed comfortable with the rhythms of mountain life, and had formed an unshakable bond with the man who had become her world. But spring also brought new challenges and decisions that McKinnon had been postponing throughout the dark months. Sarah was growing rapidly and would soon need more than their cramped shelter could provide. She needed space to crawl and eventually walk, exposure to other people for proper social development, and access to education that McKinnon, despite his Harvard background, felt unqualified to provide alone. The question that haunted his quiet moments was whether keeping Sarah in the mountains was an act of love or selfishness. He had grown so attached to her that the thought of separation was physically painful, but he also remembered Martha's dreams for her daughter's future. Would a mountain hermit and an isolated cabin really give Sarah the life her parents had envisioned? The answer came from an unexpected source. In early May, as McKinnon was teaching Sarah to identify different bird calls during one of their daily explorations, they heard the sound of approaching horses echoing through the valley. McKinnon immediately went on alert. Visitors were rare in this remote location, and not all of them had friendly intentions. What emerged from the tree line was a small party of riders led by Baptiste Mercier, whose familiar bulk was unmistakable even at a distance. Behind him rode two other men McKinnon didn't recognize, and bringing up the rear was a wagon driven by a woman in a practical travel dress. "Ezra!" Mercier called out as they approached. "I bring friends who wish to meet the famous mountain father." The woman driving the wagon proved to be Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a physician from Denver who had been traveling through the territory documenting frontier medical practices. She was perhaps 40 years old, with graying brown hair and intelligent eyes that reminded McKinnon painfully of Martha. The two men with her were Samuel Morrison, a circuit judge, and James Fletcher, a representative from the territorial government. "Mr. McKinnon," Dr. Hartwell said, after introductions had been made, "Baptiste has told us quite a remarkable story about you and this little one. Would it be possible to examine the child? I'd like to ensure she's developing properly, given the unusual circumstances of her upbringing." McKinnon felt a surge of protective instincts, but forced himself to remain calm. These people seemed genuinely concerned for Sarah's welfare, and he had to admit that a professional medical opinion would be valuable. Dr. Hartwell's examination of Sarah was thorough and gentle, and her conclusions were reassuring. "She's a healthy, well-developed child," the doctor announced. "Her motor skills are actually advanced for her age, and her social responsiveness is excellent. Whatever you've been doing, Mr. McKinnon, it's working." Judge Morrison leaned forward with interest. "The question we've come to discuss is what happens next. We've investigated the circumstances of Sarah's parents and the wagon train that abandoned them. Legally, the child has no living relatives and no legitimate guardians." McKinnon felt his chest tighten. "Are you here to take her away from me?" "That depends," Fletcher said carefully, "on what you want and what's best for the child. We've heard about your situation, and frankly, it's unprecedented. A single man raising an infant in complete isolation isn't something our laws were designed to address," Dr. Hartwell spoke up. "What I see here is a child who is clearly loved and well cared for. Sarah shows no signs of neglect or developmental delays. In fact, she seems remarkably well adjusted for a child who has experienced such trauma in her early life. The question," Judge Morrison continued, "is whether you want to formalize your guardianship of this child. If so, we're prepared to help you navigate the legal process, but we need to know that you understand the full implications of what that means." McKinnon looked down at Sarah, who was sitting contentedly in his lap, playing with a wooden toy he had carved for her. The thought of losing her was unbearable, but he also knew that his own desires couldn't be the only consideration. "What would formal guardianship require?" he asked. Fletcher consulted a document from his saddlebags. "You would need to establish a permanent residence suitable for raising a child. Sarah would need access to education and regular medical care. You would be legally responsible for her welfare until she reaches majority age." "Those are significant commitments," Dr. Hartwell added gently. "Raising a child requires more than just keeping them alive and healthy. They need social interaction, intellectual stimulation, and preparation for adult life in society." McKinnon was quiet for a long time, considering options he had never imagined having to face. Finally, he spoke. "What if I were willing to relocate closer to civilization? Not all the way into a town, but somewhere Sarah could have access to. Schools and other children, while still being able to experience the mountains she was born to?" Baptiste Mercier's face lit up with understanding. "Ah, I think I know what you are considering, mon ami. The valley near my trading post, yes, there is good land there, suitable for building." "You would do that?" Dr. Hartwell asked. give up your solitary life to provide Sarah with opportunities? McKinnon looked at Sarah again, remembering Martha's final words about every day the child lived being a victory over the forces that had tried to destroy her. "Sarah isn't just my responsibility," he said quietly. "She's my daughter now. In every way that matters, I want her to have the life her parents dreamed of for her." The legal proceedings took several weeks to complete, but by midsummer, McKinnon found himself the official guardian of Sarah Brennan, with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. More importantly, he had begun construction of a cabin in the valley near Mercier's trading post, close enough to civilization to provide Sarah with educational opportunities, but remote enough to maintain the mountain lifestyle that had shaped them both. Dr. Hartwell had agreed to return twice yearly to monitor Sarah's health and development, while Judge Morrison had arranged for a circuit teacher to visit the valley during winter months when travel was difficult. Sarah would have access to books, formal education, and social interaction with the children of other frontier families, while still growing up in the wild country that McKinnon believed had made her strong. As autumn painted the aspen groves in brilliant gold, McKinnon stood in the doorway of their new cabin, watching 11-month-old Sarah take her first tentative steps across the wooden floor he had laid with his own hands. She wobbled uncertainly for a moment, then broke into a delighted giggle as she reached the chair that had been her goal. "That's my girl," McKinnon said, scooping her up and spinning her around. "Your mama always said you'd be a walker early. Smart and determined, just like her." Sarah laughed and babbled in response, reaching up to touch McKinnon's beard with the familiarity of a child who had never known fear or abandonment. To her, this gruff mountain man was simply Papa, the most important person in her world. That evening, as Sarah slept peacefully in the crib he had built in her own small room, McKinnon sat by the fire, reading a letter that had arrived that day from Dr. Hartwell. The physician had been corresponding with colleagues in Denver and had found a family willing to take Sarah if McKinnon ever felt unable to care for her properly. McKinnon folded the letter carefully and placed it in the wooden box where he kept important documents. It was good to know that options existed, but he couldn't imagine any circumstances that would make him willing to give up Sarah now. She had become the center of his world, the reason he got up each morning, the future he was building with his own hands. "Tomorrow we'll start working on that bookshelf," he told Sarah's sleeping form. "You're going to need somewhere to keep all those books Dr. Hartwell is sending for you. And maybe next spring, when you're walking steady, we'll take a trip up to see our old shelter. I want to show you where your mama and I first realized how strong and special you are." Outside, the wind whispered through the pines with the same voice McKinnon had listened to during his years of solitude. But now that voice seemed to carry different messages. Not loneliness and isolation, but promise and possibility. The mountain hermit who had thought his story was ending had discovered instead that it was just beginning. Sarah stirred in her sleep, making the soft sounds that meant she was dreaming. McKinnon wondered what those dreams contained, perhaps memories of her mother's voice, or visions of the adventures that lay ahead, or simply the wordless contentment of a child who knew herself to be completely loved. Whatever challenges the future might bring, McKinnon was no longer facing them alone. He had a daughter to raise, a life to build, and a promise to keep to a brave woman who had trusted him with her most precious gift. The settlers had been wrong when they told Martha she would die alone in the mountains. She lived on in Sarah's laugh, in her curiosity about the world, in her fearless approach to life's obstacles, and the mountain man who had once believed himself incapable of love had learned that the heart has room for miracles, even in the harshest wilderness. As the fire settled into glowing embers and the cabin grew quiet around them, McKinnon knew with absolute certainty that every difficult step of their journey had led to exactly where they belonged. Together, safe, and home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.